3:44 AM Finland Standard Time. Finland shares 1,340 kilometers of land border with Russia, the longest NATO-Russia land frontier that existed anywhere on the alliance's perimeter before Finland's accession in April 2023. Before that accession, the nearest NATO territory to St. Petersburg was 1,300 kilometers to the west. After it, the nearest NATO territory to St. Petersburg was the Finnish municipality of Lappeenranta, 180 kilometers from the city center. The strategic geometry of Northern Europe had been permanently altered in a single ratification vote, and both NATO and the Russian Federation had been calculating the operational implications of that alteration since the moment the vote was confirmed. The Russian Federation's Northern Fleet and the Western Military District had begun their response planning within 72 hours of Finland's accession vote. The planning had a specific operational premise. The Finnish and Norwegian air bases that would now be available to NATO air power represented a transformed threat to the Kola Peninsula's nuclear submarine infrastructure, the Northern Fleet's surface basing at Murmansk and Severomorsk, and the strategic depth that Russia had depended on for the entirety of the post-Cold War period to protect its most critical second strike assets. Finnish and Norwegian airspace had become, in a single vote, an existential concern for Russian nuclear deterrence planners. The response options that emerged from that planning, reconstructed through signals intelligence collection and the forensic analysis of Russian military exercise patterns over the following 18 months, converged on a specific operational concept: a preemptive conventional strike against the 4 NATO air bases in Finland and Norway that provided the forward positioning capability for any NATO strike package against Kola Peninsula infrastructure. Rovaniemi in Finnish Lapland, Oulu on Finland's western coast, Bodø in northern Norway, and Evenes, the recently expanded fighter base that had received F-35A aircraft under Norway's defense investment plan. Strike those 4 bases, and NATO's ability to project conventional air power into the Kola threat corridor would be reduced for a minimum of 48 to 72 hours, the window in which the Russian Federation could demonstrate that the new NATO-Russia border geometry was strategically untenable at an acceptable military cost. At 3:44 AM, the Northern Fleet's long-range aviation and cruise missile assets executed that concept. From 4-2-22M, 3 backfire bombers operating from Engels Air Base on approach headings toward the Gulf of Finland, 32 Kh-22 cruise missiles released over the Baltic Sea at 3:44 AM on trajectories toward Rovaniemi, Oulu, Emari in Estonia, and the combined F-35 and supporting infrastructure complex at Bodø. The Kh-22 was a Mach 4.6 anti-ship and land attack missile. Old by current standards, designed for carrier penetration rather than precision ground attack, with a CEP measured in hundreds of meters rather than meters, but carrying a 1,000-kilogram warhead that compensated for its imprecision with destructive radius. Against an airfield, a 1,000-kilogram warhead impacting anywhere within 300 meters of a runway threshold was an operational effect. Simultaneously, from Iskander-M brigade positions at Pskov Oblast and the Leningrad Military District, 41 cruise and ballistic missile variants launched in a 17-second window at 3:44 AM. The Iskanders' targets were not the air bases. The air bases were the 2-22M3's target set. The Iskanders' targets were the NATO ground-based air defense infrastructure that protected those air bases, the PAC-3 battery at Rovaniemi, the NASAMS installations covering Oulu and the southern Finnish approach axis, the Patriot battery that had been forward deployed to Evenes under the alliance's Eastern Flank Reinforcement Program 6 weeks earlier, and the AN/TPY-2 radar installation at Luostari that provided the theater ballistic missile defense sensor coverage for the Finnish and Norwegian air defense network. The logic was sequential by design, and its internal coherence was sound when modeled against the defensive architecture that had existed before Finland's accession. In the pre-accession architecture, Finnish air bases were defended by Finnish NASAMS batteries operating under Finnish National Command. Norwegian bases were defended by Norwegian systems under Norwegian Command, and the two systems shared no real-time engagement data. A coordinated Russian strike against both simultaneously would have required both national systems to independently manage their respective Iskander packages while also managing the Kh-22s, a task that exceeded each national system's standalone capacity by design. The saturation logic worked against two independent national systems. The logic was sequential by design. The Kh-22s were slow enough relative to the Iskander's ballistic trajectory that the Iskander rounds would reach their targets before the Kh-22s, degrading the air defense infrastructure before the cruise missiles needed to penetrate it. The sequence required the Iskanders to neutralize the PAC-3 and NASAMS batteries in the terminal engagement window, and the Kh-22s to exploit the resulting coverage gap before the batteries could recover or be reinforced. The sequence had one timing assumption that had not been validated against the actual defensive posture: that the PAC-3 battery at Rovaniemi and the Patriot at Evenes were operating independently of each other and would need to be separately engaged. They were not. Both batteries had been integrated into the joint Finnish-Norwegian-US Cooperative Engagement Capability Network that had been established as a condition of Finland's accession, a network that linked every air defense sensor and interceptor in the Finnish and Norwegian theaters into a single coordinated architecture, sharing track data and engagement assignments across the entire northern flank in real time. The Iskander targeting the Rovaniemi PAC-3 battery was being tracked by a sensor in Norway. The Iskander targeting the Evens Patriot was being tracked by a sensor in Finland. Both were being engaged by whichever system in the network had the best geometry. The AN/TPY-2 radar at Luostari, the Iskander's highest priority sensor target, had detected the launch signatures from Pskov Oblast at 3:44 a.m. and 31 seconds. The alert reached SEISUR's Northern Europe Operations Cell and the Finnish Air Force Command at 3:44 a.m. and 44 seconds. The Joint Air Defense Network's pre-authorization protocols activated at 3:44 a.m. and 51 seconds. 7 seconds from first alert to full network engagement activation. The Iskanders had been in the air for 20 seconds. F-35. A aircraft from the Finnish Air Force's 31st Fighter Squadron at Rovaniemi had been at 7-minute alert status since 2 a.m., following an intelligence update that had characterized the Pskov Oblast Iskander deployment as having reached probable operational launch status. The 7-minute alert had been the most elevated Finnish Air Force peacetime readiness state since the Cold War. At 3:44 a.m. and 51 seconds, the 7-minute alert became irrelevant. The aircraft would not be airborne before the Iskanders arrived. The pilots ran toward their aircraft anyway. The ground crews were already removing wheel chocks. The Iskander engagement proceeded through the joint CEC network simultaneously across the Finnish and Norwegian theater. PAC-3 MSE batteries at Rovaniemi and Oulu engaged the ballistic tracks assigned to their coverage sectors. The Patriot at Evenes engaged the tracks assigned to the Norwegian axis. Norwegian NASAMS batteries at Bardufoss and Saraisa covered the cruise missile suppression role against the anti-radiation missiles that the Iskander launch package included. 6 AARGM, equivalent anti-radiation rounds aimed at the radar systems that the joint network depended on. 33 of 41 Iskander rounds were intercepted between 3:48 a.m. and 3:55 a.m. across the combined defensive engagement sequence. The CEC network's joint engagement architecture had performed as designed. The coverage geometry that would have existed as isolated national defense systems had been superseded by a coordinated engagement plan that assigned interceptors based on optimal geometry rather than national ownership of the battery. 8 Iskanders were not intercepted. 3 impacted the AN/TPY-2 radar site at Luostari. the highest priority target in the Iskander strike package. The radar's primary array sustained 2 direct hits from Iskander warheads. The array was non-operational. The backup radar, a secondary AESA unit positioned 400 meters from the primary, survived the impacts and was operational within 3 minutes. The backup provided reduced capability coverage that the network compensated for by increasing the sensor contribution from the Norwegian coastal radar at Bodø and the E3A AWACS maintaining station over the Norwegian Sea. 2 Iskanders impacted the Rovaniemi airbase perimeter, one striking the main apron edge and one impacting a fuel storage area in the base's southern infrastructure zone. The fuel storage fire was contained by base fire suppression teams within 19 minutes. Structural damage to 3 support hangars. No operational aircraft were in the apron impact area. The alert aircraft had completed their dispersal to hardened shelters prior to impact. The base remained operationally capable for strike and air defense missions from its primary runway. 2 Iskanders targeted the Patriot battery at Evans, a direct engagement against the air defense system defending the F-35 base. Both were intercepted within 400 meters of the battery perimeter by the battery's own PAC-3 rounds in a close-range terminal engagement that the battery commander had not anticipated executing at the distance that resulted. The intercepts were confirmed. The battery was undamaged. The 2 Norwegian F-35 pilots who had been in the pre-flight area adjacent to the battery saw the intercepts from 200 meters. One of them later described the terminal phase of the PAC-3 round as resembling something between lightning and a camera flash at very close range. He was airborne 4 minutes later. His aircraft was the second of 6 F-35, as that cleared the Evans runway in a 6-minute window between 3:57 a.m. and 4:03 a.m. Each aircraft departing on a combat heading rather than a standard departure profile, the pilots accepting the workload of weapon systems activation during takeoff roll rather than waiting for level flight. The Finnish Air Force pilots at Rovaniemi had executed the same compressed departure sequence 3 minutes earlier. 14 minutes after the first Russian launch, 12 F-35As from 2 countries were airborne and climbing toward the KH-22 engagement geometry on vectors from the E-3A AWACS that had been tracking the 222 M3 bombers since 3:51 a.m. 1 Iskander impacted the JASSM's radar at Bardufoss, a sensor node, not a launcher. The radar was rendered non-operational. The JASSM system continued operating on its alternative radar mode using its onboard passive infrared sensors for terminal engagement guidance. Its effectiveness was reduced against high-altitude, high-speed targets. It remained operational. The 8 Iskander impacts had produced effects. Not the effects the operational plan had required. The plan required the PAC-3 and Patriot batteries to be non-operational before the KH-22s arrived. The batteries were operational. The KH-22s arrived at 4:02 a.m., 18 minutes after the Iskander's first impacts. The KH-22's Mach 4.6 approach speed gave the Joint Air Defense Network a compressed engagement window from radar acquisition to CIWS threshold of approximately 4 minutes at the distances involved. The PAC-3 and Patriot systems were not optimized for engaging a large Mach 4.6 cruise missile. Their designed engagement envelope prioritized ballistic threats. JASSM's was the primary KH-22 engagement system, supplemented by Norwegian-evolved Sea Sparrow missile batteries at coastal positions and the F-35A aircraft that had been scrambled from both Rovaniemi and Bodø in the 3 minutes between the Iskander impacts and the KH-22's radar acquisition. The F-35A pilots from Rovaniemi and the Norwegian F-35As from Bodø were airborne at 3:58 a.m., 14 minutes after the operation began, 4 minutes before the KH-22S arrived at engagement range. 14 minutes was the fastest scramble response that either airbase had ever executed. The 7-minute alert state had not made them airborne before the Iskanders arrived. It had made them airborne before the KH-22s arrived, The F-35As carried AIM-120D extended-range AMRAAMs and AIM-9X sidewinders against a Mach 4.6 cruise missile in a head-on engagement geometry. The AIM-120D's closing speed advantage translated to engagement envelopes that the F-35A pilots had trained against in simulation, but had not executed in operational conditions. 17 of the 32 KH-22s were intercepted by F-35AEA, IM-120D engagements and by NASAMS in the outer and mid-range zones. 15 reached the terminal engagement phase. NASAMS, operating in its reduced effectiveness mode from the Bardufoss passive infrared sensors, engaged 9 of the 15 terminal phase KH-22s. 7 were intercepted. 2 penetrated to within 3 kilometers of Bodø Air Base before their Mach 4.6 terminal approach and the maneuvering geometry put them inside the NASAMS engagement floor. Both were engaged by the Norwegian Short-Range Air Defense System, the SHORAD batteries that represented the final engagement layer before impact. One was neutralized at 1.1 kilometers from the base perimeter. The second impacted the Bodø runway surface at 4:04 a.m. The warhead detonated on contact. The resulting crater at the runway's eastern threshold measured 31 meters. Bodø's primary runway was non-operational. The base's F-35 operations were immediately transferred to the dispersal plan that had been exercised 4 times in the preceding 11 months, a distribution of aircraft across 3 alternate Norwegian air bases within 200 kilometers of Bodø, whose runways had been certified for F-35A operations specifically because the concentrated base structure had been assessed as a vulnerability. The Bodø aircraft dispersal was complete by 4:31 a.m., 27 minutes from impact to operational aircraft at alternate bases. The F-35 air wing was not grounded. It was distributed. The dispersal plan had been rehearsed 4 times in the preceding 11 months, specifically because the concentrated basing at Bodø had been identified in every NATO northern flank vulnerability assessment as a first strike priority. The rehearsals had produced a dispersal time estimate of 32 minutes under optimum conditions. The actual dispersal, conducted under the stress of a confirmed enemy strike while the damage control teams were still assessing the runway impact, completed in 27 minutes, 5 minutes faster than the optimum rehearsal figure. The base operations officer who coordinated the dispersal logged the completion time at 4:31 a.m. and did not comment on the 5-minute differential. The aircraft were at their alternate bases. That was the number that mattered. 4 KH-22s had targeted Rovaniemi directly. 2 were intercepted by F-35A engagements. 2 reached the terminal phase and were engaged by PAC-3 MSE at ranges of 6 and 4 kilometers. Both were intercepted. Rovaniemi was undamaged. 3 KH-22s targeted Oulu. All 3 were intercepted by the NASAMS battery covering the western approach axis, a clean engagement sequence that was the joint network's most effective single engagement event of the night. 4 KH-22s targeted the Estonian base at Emari, the furthest south of the strike packages, requiring the longest KH-22 transit time and therefore the most advanced warning for the defending systems. All 4 were intercepted by Estonian NASAMS and PAC-3 assets operating through the same joint CEC network that had coordinated the Finnish and Norwegian engagements. By 4:09 a.m., 25 minutes after the first Russian launch, the active engagement phase was complete. The joint northern flank defense had managed 73 weapons across 2 strike packages and 4 target bases simultaneously, through a coordinated architecture that had been in operational service for 18 months. The counter-operation execute authorization had been transmitted by Cesure at 3:48 a.m., 4 minutes after the first Russian launch, while the Iskander engagement was still active. The F-35As from Rovaniemi and Bodø now at altitude over northern Finland and Norway respectively, were vectored to their assigned strike packages. The counter-operation targeting was constrained by the same political architecture that had limited NATO's Baltic scenario response. Every aim point inside Russian territory required a SECURE-level authorization. That authorization had been pre-coordinated under the same defensive engagement framework as the Iskander pre-delegation. The two 22M3 bombers that had launched the KH-22S were the primary counter-operation priority. All four had already released their weapons and were in egress on north-northeast headings toward Russian airspace. F-35. As from Bodø's dispersed elements were in intercept geometry on the egressing bombers over the Barents Sea. International airspace. The engagement authorization for aircraft that had released weapons against NATO territory from international airspace had been the subject of the same careful pre-coordination that had governed the Baltic scenario response. The authorization applied. 3 of the 4 Tu-22M3s were engaged by AIM-120D before clearing the international to Russian-administered airspace boundary over the Barents. All 3 were assessed as non-operational. The 4th, Tu-22M3, cleared the Russian-administered airspace boundary before the F-35A intercept geometry closed within firing range. It was not engaged further. The boundary had defined the window. JASSM-ER strikes from the F-35, as against the Pskov Oblast, Iskander launch infrastructure, and the Leningrad Military District command nodes that had coordinated the launch sequence followed between 4:17 a.m. and 4:44 a.m. 16 of 19 priority aim points received confirmed or assessed weapon impacts. 3 required follow-on assessment. Time from first Russian launch to end of active engagement, 25 minutes. Counter-operation strikes complete, 4:44 a.m. Russian weapons employed, 32 Katyr KH-22 cruise missiles from 4, 2 22M3 bombers, 41 Iskander-M cruise and ballistic variants from Pskov Oblast and Leningrad Military District. Total, 73 weapons across 2 strike packages. Intercept rates: Iskander package, 80.5%, 33 of 41. KH-22 package, 90.6%, 29 of 32, 3 effective. Bodø runway, Luostari primary radar, Bardufoss NASAMS radar. Combined intercept rate, 84.9%. Effects: Bodø primary runway, non-operational. F-35 operations dispersed to 3 alternate bases by 4:31 a.m. Luostari AN/TPY-2 primary array non-operational. Backup operational within 3 minutes. Bardufoss NASAMS radar non-operational. Passive mode operational. Rovaniemi fuel storage fire contained 19 minutes. Base operational throughout. 3 Tu-22M3s non-operational over Barents Sea in international airspace. NATO assets. 0 aircraft losses. All aircraft dispersed or recovered before KH-22 impacts. 2 personnel moderate injuries from Iskander apron impact at Rovaniemi. Both returned to duty before 5 a.m. JASSM-ER strike on 16 of 19 priority Russian infrastructure aim points. The AN/TPY-2 backup radar at Luostari came online at 3:58 a.m., 3 minutes and 12 seconds after the primary array was struck. The sensor specialist who ran the backup initialization sequence had been rehearsing it quarterly for 9 months. The procedure specified 5 minutes. She completed it in 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The sensor data from the backup began feeding the joint CEC network at 3:58 a.m. The KH-22s had not yet reached Finnish radar coverage. The backup came online before it was needed. The Russian Federation had spent 3 years calculating the operational concept that would demonstrate the strategic untenability of the new NATO-Russia border geometry in Northern Europe. The concept had required the Iskanders to suppress the air defenses before the Kh-22s arrived. The Iskanders had achieved 8 of 41 impacts. The air defenses were operational when the Kh-22s arrived. 29 of 32 Kh-22s had been neutralized. 1 had impacted a runway. The runway's aircraft had been distributed to alternate bases in 27 minutes. The new NATO-Russia border geometry remained intact. The air bases remained operational. The F-35s were flying from alternate strips. 3 Tu-22M3s were in the Barents Sea. The calculation had not produced the intended result.